All right, everyone. We're about to resume. So welcome back from lunch. We hope you enjoyed. We're moving into an excellent panel with, that should be an interesting conversation, an interesting and a frank conversation on the imperative of powering the grid, managing interconnection, managing, transmission. So it's going to be an exciting conversation between Travis Kavulla, the energy editor of American Affairs and head of policy at Base Power, alongside Asim Haque, executive vice president of PJM Interconnection, and Nick Elliot, senior policy advisor at the White House National Energy Dominance Council. So please welcome our excellent panelists to the stage.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks for those of you who decided to come back after lunch. I hope we have some more trickle in, and great to be with you, gentlemen. PJM has just been on the front lines of the power crunch in growing demand and needing to get more power generation online. And I guess for those of you who are not terribly familiar with the power sector, it's probably worth spending just a couple minutes describing how the sector is organized in terms of energy and capacity. There's a heck of a lot of places in the United States where the sector is organized as a vertically integrated monopoly, and we look to those monopolies to invest in whatever kind of power resources they might need to serve their sort of captive base of customers. And we can just simply say that PJM ain't that, by and large. PJM instead relies on a competitive market to make sure there is adequate energy supply to power customers' homes and businesses. But it also has an important regulatory function to ensure that there's enough installed and operable steel in the ground, so-called capacity, to be able to produce that energy. And so even though it is demonopolized, people like Asim, who's an executive at PJM, maybe not Asim personally, but people in his shop are responsible for forecasting the amount of capacity that'll be needed on the system and then running an auction in order to procure enough power plants and comparable resources to make it all work. And what makes this conversation interesting is that PJM is sort of canary in the coal mine. I don't know if the canary is on life support at the moment, but for the first time ever in PJM's history, largest power market in the United States, PJM has fallen short of its so-called reliability requirement for a couple of years into the future, and is really working to make up that gap. In other words, we do not have enough supply in order to cover projected demand. And I guess the first question to Asim is just how did we get here? We used to be flush with oversupply, and now we're short. What happened?
Yeah, thank you, and good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining our discussion today. Hopefully it'll be an interesting half hour. Travis asks an excellent question. How did we get here? PJM is actually going to celebrate its 100th year anniversary next year. And I would say the last 10, maybe even 5 years have been some of the most consequential in PJM's history. Travis and I go back a ways. I was a regulator from the state of Ohio, Travis a regulator from the state of Montana. I think we served roughly around the same time. When we served, the objective was very clear. It was keep the lights on and keep the lights on at least cost. I would say over the last 10 years, and particularly the last 5 years, we have seen and we have been asked, the power sector and the grid in particular, to do a lot more. Okay, there was a period where we were asked to decarbonize the system. Okay, that is sort of one part of the story of how we have gotten here. And PJM was very vocal and very public about our concerns around not decarbonization policy, which I say this all the time. I have 2 young children. Wanting to breathe cleaner air is an incredibly laudable policy objective, but the idea of shutting down resources before replacements have been deployed and are deployed at a particular scale to make up for those retirements. And then amidst that advocacy, which is really around the 2022, 2023 timeframe, we saw a massive uptick in demand due to the proliferation of primarily data centers in our footprint. We are an area of growth in that sector. We've got Loudoun County, Virginia, which is one of the primary growth areas for data centers in the country, and a few other hotspots in the footprint that are growing. In any marketplace, when you've got this confluence of a decrease in supply or relatively flat supply and an increase in demand, you're going to get an uptick in pricing. Ultimately, that's what you're seeing in our markets, is this uptick in pricing. And then the bigger concern as a grid operator is concerns around reliability. As you referenced, we have seen a reduction in our required reserve margin below where we would like to see that reserve margin, and actually where our regulator has mandated that reserve margin. And so a series of actions that we are taking, in no small part prompted by my colleague here to my right, the National Energy Dominance Council and our governors have urged us to take particular action, which we're moving forward on. And so the how we got here is, quite the confluence of events. I think the path forward to meet the moment is really what we're focused on now.
Yeah, maybe Nick, talk a little bit about the National Energy Dominance Council, the White House joint statement with the governors of PJM. You don't often see a footprint that, in this case, is dominated by Democratic governors and the Trump administration kind of come together on something, but they sure did on this one. So maybe describe a little bit about what the kind of intervention that all of you made.
So first off, thanks for having me. I like your canary analogy. I think it's not dead, but it's breathing heavily. It's probably the best way to say it. It's also a helpful analogy because I think this is not something that is unique to PJM. PJM has a couple of things that are unique to it in terms of its restructured markets and the fact that there is a capacity market. So you're probably seeing the signal. Plus, obviously, the data center growth in Virginia is really pushing this to the front. But this is a problem that's going to happen everywhere, right? You got a question about how things came together.
Yeah. And what did it say exactly?
Well, so I think there were a couple of things that came together here. One is, and I know PJM, to your credit, you identified this early. We discussed this early. We engaged with you guys on the 202C orders to keep all the capacity we could on the grid. And I know you went through your stakeholder process last year, working through all the different options. And I think there were a lot of different very good options that were in that package. We wanted to provide PJM with clarity that all the governors are behind, and the White House was behind the idea of, yes, getting new supply online is critical. It's really important you do this through long-term contracts. That's the best way to finance it. And then we wanted to send a clear signal on cost allocation, which I think was something that was very much an active debate last year. And I think you saw that both in the PJM Statement of Principles and then Ratepayer Protection Pledge, where the hyperscalers came in and sat down with the president and kind of agreed a sort of compact as to how they were going to do this. So that's probably the key elements that we were trying to put together. I would say that I think this, you guys have, I read your white paper. I think you're absolutely asking the right questions here, which is beyond the backstop, right? How do you think about making these capacity markets work? Because there is a really important discussion that needs to happen here, which is, 20 years ago, we moved to a restructured system. Since then, we really haven't had the kind of load growth that we're going to see in the next 10 years. And one of my real open questions, and I think it's what you guys were trying to flag in that white paper, is these capacity markets have served as very good price signals to time retirement, right? They've kind of been helpful to say, like, hey, I should keep these units on another 3 years. I should keep them on for another 5 years. But they probably haven't, at least in my opinion, been a great basis for financing new capacity at an effective price. So I think that's beyond executing the backstop, getting new supply online, right? The three, I keep saying every one of our problems in the grid right now, whether it be affordability, whether it be reliability, whether it be serving data centers in abundance, is all about getting more supply online. That's obviously a function of the interconnection. what we can do to expedite just managing the interconnection process. There have been some great strides on that. It's obviously a function of permitting reform, and we've done everything we can on the rulemaking side, but we're continuing to work with Congress. And the final point is like figuring out who's going to pay for the new capacity and how to make that work. That's happening really almost seamlessly in a vertically integrated market because there's one person you're talking with, right? And there's kind of one commission. It's getting very complicated in the restructured markets. So, that's kind of how it came together, which was let's try and send a signal that this is where you need to head to. It's obviously much more complicated to get there.
Yep. And just to give some Cliff's notes to the audience, when we talk about restructured, it's a term of art that just means demonopolized or competitive for the power generation. But what's interesting is that the landscape is still permeated with regulation. And obviously we have not been content. I don't think any of the three of us have been content up here to simply accept the idea that we're going to treat generating capacity as sort of a pure commodity where everyone is just exposed like they would be to the price of the pump for gasoline. There's sort of some kind of social compact going on here where we're not going to let, escalating demand where supply isn't catching up with it cause price effects that are visited entirely upon legacy consumers. We're instead going to take a step to have sort of a separate procurement to bifurcate the capacity market. So there's sort of a capacity market classic, and then there's going to be a separate so-called backstop procurement that's intended to fill the gap that of the shortfall and ideally allocate those costs directly onto new large loads, data centers.
I think that's a really good point, and one worth emphasizing is growth in load serving more power, if done right, and if done right is the critical piece, right? That should be net reducing to overall bills and overall rates for residential customers, right? The more you can serve off your system, this is largely still a fixed cost system, no matter how you think about it. The only marginal cost is your fuel, right? The more you can serve off that system, the more you can get to better utilization rates across transmission, across your generation footprint, right? That is the key to delivering lower and lower unit costs. It's the same in a hamburger store as it is in a utility, right? So growth is not a bad thing, but it must be done right, which is I think the basis of your paper is really the cost allocation. That's the critical thing to get right. And frankly, it's in a fully integrated system. There's one guy you go talk to, right? And that's actually pretty easy to figure out. In a restructured market, it is a lot more difficult, and there are a lot more players. And I think the PJM statement was as much about setting the framework for where we need to go on that.
So Asim, why don't you detail how you are going to deliver us this win-win of facilitating growth while protecting legacy consumers? What is PJM doing to sort of achieve that double whammy, the double win, not whammy?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we are in a very dynamic period here. And so we have to take a step back and figure out these various trade-offs of reliability and cost, and specifically who pays, and the market structure that has historically existed to sort of preserve reliability and allocate costs to consumers via wholesale costs. There's a difference between wholesale and retail. We'll touch on that for just a second. But at least for now, the game plan is, like we've discussed, the capacity market that we currently operate is now capped until mid-2030. That was also part of the statement of principles, okay? If you're going to cap the market that you utilize to try and send the signal that you need new investment, you're going to need a different way to obtain that new investment. That's that backstop procurement that we're doing right now. We're planning for right now to initiate in September, okay? That backstop procurement should procure for a shortfall for a particular delivery year. And then those costs are meant to be allocated to data centers because an enormous component of this is ultimately who pays, okay? Now, part of the reason why the statement of principles that the White House and our governors all executed was important was because there was an acknowledgement in that document from our state governors that they are ultimately responsible for cost allocation. Okay, we actually sent a letter to all of our governors very recently saying, hey, remember what you signed off on here? We haven't seen a ton of activity. And if when we run this backstop procurement, when those bills come due from a wholesale perspective to the retail consumer, if you have not figured this out, then it is unclear that your, whether it's residential or small business or whoever consumer, is not going to be footing the bill for this. So you need to work on this. Okay. So again, the game plan for affordability concerns. Okay. Market's capped until mid 2030. We're going to execute this backstop, procure power. Those costs are then supposed to be allocated to data centers. Now, in the meantime, the paper that I think, Nick, the paper that you referenced, asks very critical questions about these trade-offs between, really a combination of, characterize it as economic development and load growth, the preservation of reliability, cost, policy. These are all very important trade-offs, okay, that have to be made. If you want to lean hard on the affordability side, you may compromise yourself from a reliability perspective, and vice versa, okay? So part of the sort of, the paper sort of calls the question. It articulates 3 different paths that we can proceed down as we design sort of the next iteration of markets. And the capacity market is sort of the primary feature. And just for folks who don't know the difference, the capacity market effectively procures enough power for a given period of time, whereas energy is actually what you pay for to produce the watt. Okay. And so capacity is the primary feature of what this paper is meant to kind of get at and have folks consider. But these trade-offs are not trade-offs that PJM Interconnection as a grid operator and what is effectively just an operator of wholesale markets can make. Okay, our states in particular are going to have to be very active in determining what path they want to proceed down because we're being asked to do and be all things. Okay, we're being asked to allow for all of this data center growth. Okay, which is imperative to the advancement of, our country's future. Understood. Okay, we are also asked to maintain the same level of reliability that we have done historically. We're being asked to keep costs totally stagnant, affordable to the best of our ability, and we're being asked to decarbonize the system still in some pockets. It's a lot of asks for, a grid operator whose primary charge is to keep the lights on, and it requires trade-offs that us as the grid operator don't know that we should be trying to make here.
I mean, there's certainly been a lot more political interest in PJM. I hear a lot more people talking about it, people who probably didn't know, anything about, may still not know.
My wife now knows what PJM is. and my mother-in-law.
So a good thing and a bad thing. We like people knowing about power markets. I wonder, to both of you, I suppose, since you both talk to states a lot, is the sort of state capacity there to actually be able to know what the challenging questions are and to be able to resolve them through the trade-offs you're mentioning, Asim? Or are we still living in a world where it's mostly about political recriminations falling back on you?
Nick, you go ahead, please.
So I get this same versions of the same question here a lot, which is, this trade-off, affordability, reliability, serving data centers, right? This triangle. I think this is a false dichotomy, right? Every one of these things gets solved by more supply, right? So key issue here, figure out the best means to get as much, I always get this mixed up, UCAP, right? Like adjusted capacity value in PJM online as quickly as possible. That's going to have a downward like impact on prices. It's going to help the reliability picture and absolutely increase peak load serving capability. If you can get the cost right and the cost allocation right, like, yes, you can like lower unit costs. That's your kind of perfect solution. And again, step away from PJM and look at what's happening like down in the Southeast, right? Within, I don't know, 4 months, we turned around, very substantial loans, large amounts of new capacity getting built, right? That capacity is serving new large loads, right? Those are on long-term contracts, right? So that there's no stranded risk to existing ratepayers. There are rates that are specifically designed to lower rates for residential customers. So there are explicit like price caps or fixes across the board for retail rates, right? There should be actual, at least in real terms, downward movements in prices over the next 5 to 10 years there. So like you can make this work. You just got to find a way to get the market structure to work around it.
Anything to add to that?
I think I will not dispute Nick's thought there that new supply cures all. The challenge I think that we've got here is that we've got a lot of supply that is frankly through our generation interconnection queue. We've got a lot of supply that is seeking to interconnect right now. Now, we're going to process these applications, right? We are going to electrically study 200, so we're a 180,000 megawatt system roughly, right? We have 200,000 megawatts that have said, we want you to study us to see if we can connect to the queue. Now, the historic completion rate of that collective will be anywhere from 10 to 20%, right? But even then, you get 20 to 40 gigs through that one queue cycle. It's a pretty good number, okay? And so for us, there is certainly I would agree with Nick that we want to see a lot more supply find its way to the system. The challenge is once you're done with PJM and you've got nothing left to do with us, why aren't you building out, or why have you not built out to this point? And so we've got to get that supply, effectively built out, and that is a collection of different folks who are involved in that, including us.
So you're absolutely right. Just to echo your point, right? If supply is the solution, it is a stool that has 3 legs. One of them is interconnection. You guys are moving on that, and really applaud where you're coming out on RI. And anything we can do to help you go quicker, we are always available on that, right? So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is permitting. Really nothing you can do about that, right? That's really a function of really what's going on in the States for the most part. But like without that leg of the stool, like none of this is going to work. And the third piece is financing. So who's going to pay for it? And there, I think there is absolutely a role around how these capacity markets work, and as much how these capacity markets work, but how the cost allocation works to try and create the right incentives for bilateral contracting on the part of the large loads, right? So if you get the pass through, and I know it's complex running through FERC, through the State Commission, to individual attribution of the new large load that comes online, right? At some point you get this balance right, you will contract directly rather than, via these different steps. And at that point you solve the financing problem. So that's at least in my mind, the 3 legs of the stool.
Yeah. Changing gears quite a bit maybe. PJM has really seen over the last couple of decades a real transformation going from an RTO that had a lot of coal, a lot of nuclear, a lot of natural gas, to being one that is much more dependent on natural gas. Nuclear has kind of flatlined, declined a little bit with retirements. There's been a lot of coal retiring. And we've certainly seen some frailties in the system, in the relationship between the gas pipeline network and PJM, over the course of a number of years. I just wonder if either of you have any thoughts on how many eggs can go into the natural gas basket before we think about, still other types of interventions that might, enforce some kind of fuel diversity standard or have some kind of, technological diversity dimension in mind. And obviously there are certain elements of the capacity market I don't know that we can possibly introduce people to ELCC at the moment, but maybe talk a little bit about how markets intend to grapple with that phenomenon.
Yeah, look, I think right now we are a system that is about half natural gas. If you look at all of those resources that are through our queue right now, they're all renewable. Okay. Now, if you look at the resources that have applied to be in our queue, okay, this is about half natural gas, and then half we'll just characterize it as other. Okay. So we've still got a pretty diverse fleet, but Winter Storm Elliot did create, I think, some true concern about a continued problem with gas electric coordination. And this is an issue that has existed for a long time now. I think there are various, whether it's federal agencies and state action, wherein we've tried to create some harmonization here. But I think certainly that's, an effort. The more we rely on natural gas, that will gain more attention. And, unfortunately, it takes, an event to have people really provide and focus attention on what's going on with the combination of the gas and electric systems.
So I have hairs sticking up on the back of my neck when you talk about gas, just because of Fern this year, and I don't think people realize just how tight the system was, even this year. There's 100,000 megs, so call it 100 gigs of gas capacity in PJM, and I think we're at a 78% ELCC factor. So, let's assume that the unforced outage rate is 10%. Like, there's a 12% uplift, or the equivalent of 12 gigs of incremental UCAP just by fixing the pipeline infrastructure. It's kind of insane that we're not doing that, right? Obviously there's a permitting component to that, but there's also a states level. So if you talk about my concern around the U.S. generally, and specifically the Northeast and PJM, I am not worried about having enough turbines to scale into the new load we have. I think we're building enough. I'm much, much more concerned about having enough pipeline infrastructure built so that we can build this in the places we need to build. Yeah. So it's that linear infrastructure that is probably the biggest, understated challenge in the system right now.
And I think what we try and do is in the marketplace, value those gas units that have done some of the, we'll just call it resilience and redundancy work, more than others. And so you create this categorization of you are actually going to be compensated more in the market because you are dual fuel, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
just to call out to PJM, right? I'm kind of having flashbacks to Winter Storm Fern here, but you guys did a fantastic job. You made, very hard market decisions, on the Friday ahead of that storm with very imperfect information. And, we were on the phone every couple of hours, but it was not a good situation where you had to commit to gas on a Friday before a Monday with that kind of storm coming through, not being sure that you were going to have the fuel you needed to run the gas units.
Funny enough, it happens every winter. Right?
No,
it's just about every winter.
Right. and that I think, circling all the way back to the beginning, is kind of the third element, in addition to rising demand and some supply side retirements. It is also a story about kind of the diminishing marginal returns of gas units in terms of their contributions toward capacity, unless you do reinforce the gas system. And that would free up new capacity as well, but that's a long putt. Any final words, Nick?
Yeah, I know we kind of out of time, and I just want to level set here that there's definitely, when you get into a PJM discussion and a structure around markets, it starts to feel very glass half full. Right, a little bit depressing. The opportunities on the back of AI we don't really talk about, but they're going to have real impacts in people's lives. Right, from I can give you a list. Like my dad is a doctor. He works all day but comes home and does paperwork all night. Right. If we look at the nursing, the nurses in the U.S., right, we're running out of them, but they spend 40% of their time doing paperwork. Right. If you start to think about kids in schools, the amount of time the teachers spend grading papers as opposed to actually interacting with students, right? This real world impact in terms of how you can better people's lives Ruth Port at Google was talking last week. She's a two-time cancer survivor, and she said she was at MSK in New York. They have a 75% better survival rate than anyone else, right? And said, hey, with AI we can try and democratize that, right? We can try and get the best oncology and the best data analysis of these things out to everywhere in the world, right? That's a really huge, valuable goal. If we can get the cost allocation right, one of the benefits here is you have the deepest, some of the most cash flow positive, high credit rating entities in the world that absolutely are willing to pay even more than the marginal new build cost, right? And are willing to make this work. So much so that they're willing to do it off grid, by the way, right? So they're willing to pay the tab to lower everyone's bills. So,
Take yes for an answer.
Right? I never really thought I was going to get into this political thing. I was very happy sitting in New York, but this moment is really, really interesting because, we're moving from a no load growth environment to a world where suddenly things are growing again, and there's huge opportunities on the back of that. So while I recognize this conversation is a little bit depressing in terms of getting into the weeds, I've never been more optimistic about either the U.S. or about the power markets. So I just want to leave you with that thought, which is not everything is bad.
I know both of these gentlemen. I know neither are maybe natural optimists, or Asim was before working for PJM. Maybe he still is. So, but I do thank Nick for ending us on a happy note. Thanks for joining us here at Energy Imperatives, guys.
Thank you.